You know the story? November 25, 1177. A 16-year-old king with bandaged hands and leprosy eating through his nerves. 375 knights, 80 Templars, maybe 3,000 infantry, against Saladin's 26,000. The historians call it Montgisard. They call it a miracle. But what if it wasn't? What if the mud stayed dry that day? What if Saladin's scouts had done their job? What if that small Christian army got cut down on the sand near Ramla, and Jerusalem fell 10 years early, defenseless and abandoned? Would Richard the Lionheart have even sailed? Would there be a third crusade at all? Or would the Holy Land belong to Islam for the next 800 years? William of Tyre, the archbishop and chronicler, puts the number at 26,000 men. An anonymous Syrian source counts 12,000 Turkish cavalry and 9,000 Arab troops. Modern historians say those numbers are inflated, but even conservative estimates give Saladin 15,000 to 18,000 trained soldiers, including his elite Mamluk bodyguards, men purchased as boys, converted to Islam, trained from childhood to kill. Without question, the Crusader kingdom had just sent most of its fighting force north with Philip of Alsace to attack Hama. Jerusalem was exposed. Baldwin IV, diagnosed with leprosy at age 9, now 16, and already showing nerve damage in his right arm and hand, heard the news while still recovering from malaria in Jerusalem. He grabbed 375 knights, whatever infantry he could scrape together, and rode south to Ascalon. That's the history we know. On November 25th, Baldwin breaks out of Ascalon with his knights and the Templars from Gaza. Odo de Saint-Amand, Grand Master of the Temple, brings 80 knights. They catch Saladin's dispersed army at Montgisard, near the mound of Al-Safia. Surprise attack, Crusader charge. Saladin's baggage train stuck in mud. Panic spreads through the Muslim ranks. Only 1/10 of Saladin's army makes it back to Egypt. That's the miracle. That's what kept Jerusalem Christian for another 10 years. This script is researched and factual, using sources from William of Tyre's Historia Rerum in Partibus Transmarinis Gestarum, written between 1170 and 1184, and considered the most reliable contemporary chronicle of the Crusader states, cross-referenced with Bernard Hamilton's The Leper King and His Heirs, published by Cambridge University Press in 2000, which provides the most thorough modern analysis of Baldwin's reign using primary Latin, Arabic, and Greek sources. Now back to the information. Not scattered, not surprised. Formed up in battle lines with heavy cavalry in the center, archers on the flanks, light cavalry ready to envelope from both sides. Baldwin sees the formation. He knows the numbers. 375 secular knights, 80 Templars, perhaps 3,000 infantry, spearmen, crossbowmen, some mounted sergeants, against at least 15,000, probably more. He's 16 years old. His right hand has no feeling. He can barely grip reins. But he's the king, and Jerusalem has no army left to defend it. Reynold of Chatillon, freed from 16 years in an Aleppo dungeon just last year, leads the right wing. Baldwin of Ibelin takes the left. Balian of Ibelin, his brother, anchors the center with the Templars. King Baldwin rides in the front, bandaged hands wrapped around his sword grip, using the skills his Arab riding master taught him when he was a boy. For maybe 30 minutes, pure ferocity holds. Templar discipline. Frankish heavy cavalry doing what it does best. Close quarters, shock impact, iron and blood. They punch through the first line, but Saladin's forces don't break. They absorb. They envelop. Light cavalry swings wide on both flanks. Turkish archers pour volleys into the Christian infantry. The Crusader wedge loses momentum, stops, starts to fracture. Mamluk bodyguards in their yellow robes move forward. Fresh troops, elite killers. They hit the Templar flank. Odo de Saint-Amand goes down with 3 arrows in his chest. His white mantle turns red in the sand. 20 Templars form a shield wall around his body. They die there. Baldwin of Ibelin takes a spear through the shoulder, keeps fighting until blood loss pulls him from his horse. The infantry breaks first. Crossbowmen and spearmen, watching the knights get slaughtered, start running south toward Ascalon. Saladin's light cavalry runs them down on the open ground. No mercy, no prisoners who can't pay ransom. William of Tyre, writing years later in an alternate universe where Jerusalem still stands, would have called it butchery. Contemporary Muslim sources celebrate it as divine justice. By sunset, the battlefield near Montgisard is silent except for the wounded. 340 knights dead, all 80 Templars dead or dying. Perhaps 2,000 infantry killed in the rout. 35 Christian knights captured, including Reynold of Chatillon, who will never see freedom again. Balian of Ibelin escapes with maybe 40 survivors, racing south through the darkness toward Ascalon. Cairo dungeon 8 months later, blind and unable to walk, never seeing his city again. Either way, November 25, 1177 is the day the Leper King dies. The Battle of Montgisard, in this timeline, is not a miracle. It's a massacre. Nothing like the catastrophic 90% casualties he suffered in our timeline. His army is intact. His reputation is intact. His supply lines from Egypt are secure. And the road to Jerusalem has no defenders. Word of the disaster at Montegisar arrived yesterday with Balian of Ibelin and his 40 survivors. The king is dead. The field army is destroyed. The Templars are annihilated. Most of the kingdom's knights are dead or captured. Philip of Alsace is still up north besieging Hama with whatever forces remain. No relief is coming. The city has 14 knights inside its walls. 14. Plus maybe 2,000 able-bodied men. Burgesses, merchants, craftsmen, clergy. No professional soldiers. No one who's fought in a real battle. Jerusalem's population in 1177 is perhaps 20,000, including refugees who fled Saladin's raids on Ramla and Lydda. He issues orders to store food and water. He mans the walls with militia who barely know which end of a spear kills. He sends riders to Tyre, to Tripoli, to Antioch, begging for reinforcements. But Tyre is 3 days away. Tripoli is 6. Antioch is beyond reach, and Saladin's army is already surrounding the city. Saladin positions his siege engines on the Mount of Olives, where the walls are weakest and the defenders can't sortie effectively. He has mangonels, trebuchets, mobile towers, the full siege train he brought from Egypt for exactly this purpose. His engineers are the best in the world, trained in the Islamic tradition that built Baghdad and Damascus. They know siegecraft. Frankish civilians with farming tools do not. For 5 days, the bombardment is constant. Stones the size of wine barrels crash into the northern walls. Greek fire ignites wooden defenses. Muslim archers keep the ramparts clear. The defenders fight bravely, uselessly. On December 6th, sappers tunnel under a 60-foot section of wall near St. Stephen's Gate. They prop it up with wooden supports, pack the tunnel with oil and kindling, light it. The wall collapses. Jerusalem's makeshift garrison manages to hold the breach for 1 day, barely. By nightfall on December 7th, it's clear the city cannot survive another assault. Heraclius leads a delegation out under a white banner. Saladin receives them in his tent. The patriarch offers surrender. Saladin, who in our timeline negotiated ransoms in 1187 after Hattin, is in a different mood this time. He's fresh off a battlefield victory. He hasn't spent 10 years fighting Baldwin's unexpected competence. He hasn't developed the pragmatic respect that grew between him and the leper king in our timeline, and he remembers what the First Crusade did when it took Jerusalem in 1099. The chronicles say 70,000 Muslims and Jews slaughtered, bodies stacked in the Temple Mount, blood running ankle-deep through the streets. Unconditional surrender. The city gates open by noon tomorrow, or he storms it by force and everything inside becomes lawful plunder. No ransoms, no negotiations. Muslim law permits this. A city that refuses terms and falls by assault can be sacked. Heraclius returns to Jerusalem. The population prays through the night. At dawn on December 8th, 1177, the gates open. Saladin's army enters Jerusalem. What happens next depends on which sources you trust in this alternate timeline. Muslim chronicles emphasize Saladin's mercy. He forbids his troops to massacre civilians, allows Christians to leave with whatever they can carry, converts the Church of the Holy Sepulchre back into a mosque, but doesn't destroy it. Christian sources paint a darker picture. They describe killings in the streets, women assaulted, churches looted, sacred relics destroyed. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere between. Heraclius and the surviving Latin clergy are expelled. Most of Jerusalem's Frankish population is enslaved or ransomed. Those who can pay leave for Tyre or Tripoli, those who cannot end up in slave markets from Cairo to Baghdad. The Orthodox and Eastern Christians, who never loved Latin rule anyway, are allowed to stay under Muslim protection. They pay the jizya tax and get on with their lives. By Christmas, 1177, a decade before Hattin in our timeline, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem is effectively finished. Tyre, the only major Crusader stronghold with serious fortifications and a defensible port, survives. Conrad of Montferrat hasn't arrived yet. That won't happen until 1187 in our timeline, and in this one, he may never come at all. Instead, Raymond III of Tripoli takes command of Tyre and digs in. He knows relief from Europe will take years. He knows Saladin can't storm Tyre's walls without a massive fleet. He also knows that holding one city doesn't save the kingdom. By summer 1178, the map is clear. Muslims control Jerusalem, Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon, most of the interior. Christians hold Tyre, Tripoli, Antioch, and scattered castles like Crac des Chevaliers. The Kingdom of Jerusalem exists in name only, a rump state clinging to the coast, and Europe hasn't even heard the news yet. Pope Alexander III, who spent the last decade navigating conflicts with Frederick Barbarossa and won't die until 1181, hears that Jerusalem has fallen, that the true cross is lost, that the leper king is dead. He issues a papal bull calling for a new crusade, but Europe is not ready. Frederick Barbarossa is 74 years old and locked in Italian politics. Philip II of France is 13 years old, just crowned, dealing with regency councils and territorial disputes. Henry II of England is fighting his own sons, including Richard, over control of Aquitaine. Nobody has time for a crusade. Nobody has money. The enthusiasm that drove the First and Second Crusades is gone. Europeans have seen crusades fail. They've watched armies march east and not come back. The Crusader states have existed for 80 years, and most Europeans have stopped thinking of Jerusalem as their city. It's just a place where Frankish nobles play king in a desert. When it falls, the shock is real, but the response is slow. This is based on comprehensive research using Jonathan Riley Smith's The Crusades, a history, 3rd edition, published by Bloomsbury in 2013, which synthesizes centuries of scholarship on Crusader demographics, military capacity, and European response times to Middle Eastern crises, and Christopher Tyerman's God's War. A New History of the Crusades, published by Harvard University Press in 26, which provides the most thorough analysis of how papal crusading appeals worked in practice versus theory. Back to the story. He assembles an army in 1184, 12,000 men, maybe 4,000 knights. They march overland through Hungary and Byzantine territory. Frederick dies in 1185, while crossing a river in Cilicia, just like in our timeline. Most of his army turns back. The remainder, under Leopold of Austria, reaches Tyre in 1186. Too little. Too late. Saladin has spent 8 years consolidating. His position is unshakable. Richard is 18 years old in 1177, fighting his father in Aquitaine, nowhere near taking crusading vows. By the time a serious crusade gets organized in the 1180s, Richard is King of England. Henry II dies in 1189, just like in our timeline, but he's dealing with Philip II's attempts to seize Norman territory. He never goes east. He never fights Saladin. He never wins at Arsuf or negotiates the Treaty of Jaffa. The legendary confrontation between Richard and Saladin, the mutual respect between two warrior kings, never happens. Richard dies in 1199 at Challis from a crossbow wound, just like in our timeline, but as a king who fought France, not a crusader who held the Holy Land. It aims for Constantinople instead, sacks it in 1204, establishes the Latin Empire. The 5th, 6th, 7th Crusades still happen, but they're fighting for coastal ports, not the Holy City. Jerusalem, in this alternate timeline, stays Muslim. Saladin dies in 1193 in Damascus, just like in our timeline. His empire fragments among his sons and nephews, just like in our timeline. The Ayyubid dynasty rules Egypt and Syria for decades. Then the Mamluks take over in 1250. Then the Ottomans conquer everything in 1517. Jerusalem passes from one Muslim power to another for the next 700 years. No crusader ever walks through the Holy Sepulchre again. The Catholic Church negotiates with Muslim rulers for pilgrimage access, paying fees, accepting limits. Orthodox and Armenian Christians live under Islamic rule, protected minorities paying the jizya. Jewish communities, expelled from Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099 in our timeline, return under Muslim protection in this alternate history. The city becomes majority Muslim again by the 1300s. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, never achieved the wealth and power they had in our timeline. The Templars, annihilated at Montgisard, never recover. The order disbands by 1200, its survivors absorbed into the Hospitallers. Without the Templars' banking network, European finance develops differently. Without their military presence, the Reconquista in Spain goes slower. Granada survives until the 1400s, maybe longer. The Hospitallers retreat to Rhodes earlier, in 1205 instead of 1291. They hold it for 2 centuries, fighting Turkish raiders, running a pirate state in the eastern Mediterranean. But they never become the dominant force they were in our timeline. The Teutonic Knights never go to the Baltic. That crusade depended on papal support that, in this timeline, is exhausted after the failed attempts to retake Jerusalem in the 1180s. Prussia stays pagan longer. Poland and Lithuania develop differently. Literature. In this alternate timeline, the crusading story ends in failure and embarrassment. Baldwin IV, the doomed boy king, becomes a tragic figure, not an inspiring one. Saladin is remembered as the unbeatable commander who took Jerusalem and held it. The crusading ideal sours faster. By the 13th century, Europeans are funding crusades against heretics in southern France instead of fighting for the Holy Land. The Albigensian Crusade happens earlier, lasts longer, devastates Languedoc. The Baltic Crusades never happen. The Spanish Reconquista succeeds eventually. Granada falls to Castile in 1492, just like in our timeline, because geography and demographics favor Christian kingdoms. But without the crusading mystique, it's a regional conflict, not a holy war that defines European Christianity. The Islamic world remembers Montjasar as the battle where Saladin crushed the Franks and took Jerusalem in one campaign. Not 10 years of grinding war, not the near disaster of our timeline where Baldwin's miracle victory gave the Crusaders a decade of survival. In this alternate history, Saladin's reputation is unstoppable from the start. He's the second coming of Khalid ibn al-Walid, the military genius of early Islam. His dynasty rules Egypt and Syria for generations on the strength of that legend. The Ayyubids don't collapse into squabbling nephews as fast. They hold together longer, push harder against the remaining Crusader ports, finally take Tyre in 1220, Antioch in 1230, Tripoli in 1235. By 1250, there are no Crusader states left, not even fragments clinging to the coast. The Latin East is finished. But the consequences go beyond religion and war. Trade routes shift. In our timeline, Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, made fortunes supplying Crusader states and controlling eastern Mediterranean ports. In this alternate timeline, they negotiate with Muslim powers from a weaker position. They still trade. Nobody's giving up spice and silk profits, but they pay higher tariffs, accept more restrictions, deal with Ayyubid and later Mamluk. Bureaucrats who remember that Christians once held Jerusalem and slaughtered Muslims there. Venetian merchants still get rich, but Genoa dominates eastern trade because they struck better deals with Saladin early. The balance of power among Italian maritime republics shifts. This affects the Renaissance. Genoa's wealth funds different artists, different architects. Florence develops differently without Venetian competition. Rome's prestige as the center of Christendom takes a bigger hit when Jerusalem stays lost forever. In this alternate history, the pattern is similar, but the rhetoric is different. Priests preach that the plague is divine punishment for losing Jerusalem, for failing to retake the Holy Land, for allowing Islam to triumph. This intensifies anti-Jewish violence in some regions, reduces it in others where Jewish communities have stronger protections from Muslim rulers who control Jerusalem. The net effect on Jewish populations is hard to calculate, but the geography changes. More Jews in Muslim territories, fewer in Christian Europe, different migration patterns into Eastern Europe and the Iberian Peninsula. But the Ottomans inherit a Middle East where Muslim rule has been unbroken since 1177. When Mehmed II conquers Constantinople in 1453, he's not reversing Crusader victories. He's completing Islamic expansion that never faced serious Christian resistance. The shock to Europe is the same, but the narrative is different. This is the final humiliation, not a new disaster. The Renaissance still happens. Human creativity doesn't depend on crusading success, but European identity is less militantly Christian, more focused on trade, exploration, science. Maybe the Reformation still comes in 1517 when Martin Luther nails his theses to the door in Wittenberg. Maybe it comes earlier because Catholic prestige is weaker without the crusading legacy. Maybe it takes a different form, challenges Rome on different grounds. Still genocidal against indigenous populations. But the language is different. The self-image is different. Europeans don't see themselves as warriors for Christ reconquering the world from infidels. They see themselves as traders and explorers building empires for wealth and glory. The practical result is the same. Millions dead, continents conquered, slavery on an industrial scale, but the mythology that justifies it changes. The 19th and 20th centuries see European powers carving up the Ottoman Empire, just like in our timeline. World War I happens. The Ottomans lose. The British and French take over. The Sykes-Picot Agreement divides the Middle East into artificial states. But here's where the alternate timeline creates a sharp divergence. Jerusalem, which has been Muslim for 700 years in this version of history, never has a significant Jewish or Christian population in the modern era. There's no Zionist movement in the 1800s aiming to return to a homeland that Christians never held in living memory. Theodore Herzl's dream of a Jewish state looks for a different location. Maybe Uganda, as was actually proposed in our timeline. Maybe somewhere in Eastern Europe. Maybe Argentina, which had a failed Jewish colonization attempt in the 1890s. The Holocaust still happens. Nazi ideology doesn't depend on whether Jerusalem was Christian in the Crusades, but the response is different. After World War II, the United Nations doesn't partition Palestine because there's no historical claim to it. Jewish refugees from Europe settle in other countries. The State of Israel never forms. No Six-Day War in 1967. No Yom Kippur War in 1973. No Intifada. No Oslo Accords. No current situation where three religions claim the same city and violence erupts every decade. The Middle East still has problems. Oil wealth, dictatorships, proxy wars, Islamic fundamentalism, Western intervention, but the specific conflict that defined the region from 1948 onward doesn't exist. Maybe there's more stability, maybe different conflicts erupt over other resources and borders, impossible to predict with certainty. But the butterfly effect of Montgisard going the other way, of Baldwin dying in the sand instead of winning a miracle victory, reaches all the way to the 21st century. That's how long it takes from Montgisard to Jerusalem's fall in this alternate history. In our timeline, Baldwin's victory bought a decade. The kingdom survived until 1187 when Saladin finally won at Hattin, besieged Jerusalem for 2 weeks, negotiated surrender with Balian of Ibelin. Yes, the same Balian who survived Montgisard in our timeline, who became one of the kingdom's great heroes, who saved thousands of lives through smart diplomacy. In this alternate timeline, Balian never gets that chance. He dies at Montgisard or escapes with a handful of survivors to Tyre, fades into obscurity. In this alternate history, Sibylla is in Jerusalem when it falls in 1177. She's 17 years old, pregnant with her son, the future Baldwin V, who will never be born or die in infancy in Acre. Saladin allows her to go to Tyre with the other Frankish nobles who can pay ransom. She eventually returns to France, marries some minor lord, lives a quiet life far from the disasters of the East. Guy of Lusignan never becomes king of anything. He's still in France in 1177, arrives in the Holy Land in 1180, just like in our timeline. But there's no kingdom to marry into. He fights as a mercenary for Raymond of Tripoli, maybe dies in some forgotten skirmish, leaves no mark on history. In our history, Renaud survived Montgisard, fought at Hattin 10 years later, was captured and personally executed by Saladin for breaking truces and attacking Muslim pilgrims. In this alternate timeline, Renaud is captured at Montgisard in 1177, taken to Damascus, probably executed within a year. Saladin doesn't forget that Renaud spent 16 years in a Muslim dungeon and came out unbroken, ready to fight again. The Sultan respects courage, but he also understands that some enemies are too dangerous to keep alive. Renaud dies in a Damascus prison, forgotten by everyone except the chroniclers who note his capture. Why join an order that got annihilated defending a kingdom that no longer exists? The Templars limp along for a few decades, holding castles in Tripoli and Antioch, but they're shadows of their former strength. When King Philip IV of France decides to destroy them in 1307 in our timeline, he accuses them of heresy and seizes their wealth. In this alternate timeline, there's not enough wealth to seize. The order dissolves quietly, its remaining knights absorbed into the Hospitallers or returning to secular life. Everything a medieval king could do with a dying body. In this alternate history, Baldwin is remembered as a brave fool who threw away his life and his kingdom on a doomed charge. The chroniclers are not kind. William of Tyre, writing in the 1180s, portrays Baldwin as a martyr, but questions the tactical decision to engage Saladin in the open. Did the king have any choice? Yes, argue the historians. He could have stayed in Ascalon, preserved his force, defended Jerusalem's walls with whatever garrison remained. That would have bought time for Philip of Alsace to return from Hama. Maybe the city could have held until relief arrived, or maybe not. Maybe Jerusalem was doomed either way. Mud and surprise, and Saladin's overconfidence in the sheer ferocity of 375 knights who knew they were going to die. Change one variable, dry ground, alert scouts, competent Muslim command, and the battle goes the other way. History is full of hinge moments that turned on weather and chance. If the Spanish Armada hadn't hit a storm in 1588, England might be Catholic. If Napoleon's messenger hadn't gotten lost before Waterloo, Europe might be French. If Saladin's scouts had done their job on November 25, 1177, Jerusalem might be Muslim 800 years earlier than it was in reality. We know the numbers at Montgisard. We know Saladin's army was better trained, better supplied, and overwhelmingly larger than Baldwin's desperate charge. We know that surprise was the only advantage the Christians had, and surprise is fragile. It depends on enemy mistakes. In our timeline, Saladin made mistakes. In this alternate version, he doesn't. That's the difference between miracle and massacre. The long-term consequences are harder to trace, but still grounded in historical logic. If Jerusalem falls in 1177 instead of 1187, European response is slower because the political situation in the 1170s is messier. Henry II fighting his sons, Philip II too young to lead, Frederick Barbarossa too old and too entangled in Italian politics. A delayed crusade means Saladin has more time to consolidate, which makes reconquest nearly impossible. The Crusader states collapse faster without Baldwin's decade of competent resistance. This changes the economics of Italian trade, the prestige of the papacy, the crusading ideal in European culture. All of these are documented historical forces that respond to changed conditions in logical ways. And the ultimate consequence, the one that reaches into the 21st century, follows from 700 years of unbroken Muslim rule in Jerusalem. The Zionist movement, which grew from both religious yearning and European nationalism in the 1800s, needs a historical claim to the land. If Christians never held Jerusalem in the medieval era, if the Crusades are universally remembered as failures that ended in 1177, if modern European memory doesn't include Richard the Lionheart and Saladin as romantic enemies who fought over the Holy City, then the political and cultural logic that created Israel changes. Maybe it still happens in some form. Maybe Jewish refugees after the Holocaust go to Palestine anyway and create a state through force. But the international support, the UN partition plan, the American backing, all of that was built on historical narratives that include the Crusades, Christian claims to Jerusalem, the idea that the Holy Land belongs to multiple religions with competing ancient rites. Take away the Crusader kingdoms, and that narrative weakens. And if Montresort had gone the other way, if Baldwin had died in the sand on November 25, 1177, that memory would be different. The map would be different. The 21st century would be different. 43 skeletons, all male, all showing signs of violent death. Sword cuts, arrow wounds, trauma consistent with medieval combat. Carbon dating puts them in the late 12th century. DNA analysis shows Western European ancestry. They're Crusaders. The soil around them contains fragments of chainmail, a broken Templar cross, pieces of leather and wood that might have been saddle or shield. The Israeli Antiquities Authority published the findings in Atikat, the Journal of Israeli Archaeological Research, volume 192, released in 2019. The excavation director, Dr. Yotam Tepper, noted that this is one of the few confirmed battlefield burials from the Crusader period ever found in Israel. Most bodies were either ransomed for burial or left unrecorded. This grave, hidden for 8 centuries, finally proves what the chronicles described. And in our timeline, their sacrifice bought 10 more years for Jerusalem. And the world that follows, shaped by that one battle's outcome, looks very different from the one we inhabit. Before the inevitable end, and 43 men in a Ramla grave, silent for 800 years, waiting to tell us what was at stake.